Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Carrie Anderson, production editor for TNSR. On this episode, Marshall Kosloff talks with journalist Martin Pengelly about his book, Brotherhood, When West Point Rugby Went to War.
Martin Pengelly, welcome to Horns of a Dilemma.
Thank you very much for having me. Glad to be here.
Let's start here. You came to campus last November, but we are also in the midst of the end of the Olympics. This is the Clements Center, obviously. So I'd love to hear just a quick articulation of you of the connection between sports, athletics, and national security and the military.
In my case, it's the connection through rugby. In my book's case of rugby at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, but there's plenty of other connections I've had during my life, and the rugby has certainly had. Rugby being one of the more martial sports that's basically, it's spread around the world in direct contact and links with militaries, because the British military obviously benefited from rugby being in British schools and training British officers and so on. And I think I'm right in saying that Baron de Coubertin, the founder of the modern Olympics, was a fan of rugby as used by the British Army and imported it to France for that reason. Other countries have had similar experiences with rugby. So all sports are connected to military activity, military tactics, military behavior, but rugby is particularly strongly connected. And I've been in and around that all my life before I even got to West Point, playing against people like Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in London. So it's a sort of two-way street, constant two-way street.
And this is one of those questions that's obvious, and that I also don't want you to just sort of summarize the entire book, but what was your connection to West Point and rugby in 2002, or at least the class of 2002 specifically?
I've come up with a way of boiling this down. Basically, the Army team of '02 came on tour to Europe, which they regularly did. They haven't done it so much recently. They played in France, they played Saint-Cyr, they came over to London for the main tour game against Sandhurst, RMA Sandhurst. And as a warm-up game, before they played that game, they played against a club from London, a top amateur club called Rosslyn Park. And I was playing in the second row for that club. So I played a one-off game, March 2002, against the West Point class. And it was a very memorable game, simple as that. I happened to be a writer, a journalist, an editor. I happened to marry an American and move to America more than 10 years ago. Soon after that, I decided to go and see if I could find out what had happened to this '02 team, see if there were any stories there. And there were obviously a host of stories that linked in specifically to the Iraq War. So that's how the book came about, and that's where the book goes.
Yeah, could you speak to the significance of the class of 2020? Could you speak to the significance of the class of 2002, given that that's obviously the graduating class who, going into their early senior year, experienced 9/11? So speak to that part of the legacy.
That's where I first realized there were going to be stories when it occurred to me that they were the first class to graduate after 9/11. Their final year began almost day one with 9/11, 50 some miles down the Hudson in New York City. They were the bicentennial class anyway of '02, so they were always marked out for attention. I quickly realized that if you're talking major wartime, they were the first West Point class to graduate in wartime in 30 years since Vietnam, or nearly 30 years. So that class had been written about before. By coincidence, it was written about by David Lipsky for Rolling Stone in the book that eventually became Absolutely American, which was a gold standard book that I read very, very early on. But it had also been written about afterwards. There's another book called In a Time of War by Bill Murphy Jr., a journalist for the Washington Post and other papers, who followed a few people from that class. But the rugby team, funnily enough, was a niche that had not been dug. I found out soon. So there was 15 stories. Always say one lesson of writing a book is don't try and write a 380-page book about 15 people, because you have to fit in a lot of stories. But through telling the main stories of 3 of the players and everyone else sitting around those 3, I managed to get it into a book.
Something I'm curious about, could you talk about West Point's connection to rugby as a sport specifically? Because when folks think of West Point and sports, they're going to think of the Army-Navy game. They're going to think of football. You go into a bit of the history of how like rugby and football, especially in the 19th century, are tied together narratively. So give that history, but then tie things back to West Point and rugby specifically.
Yeah. So the history is actually coming up. The 150th anniversary of the first generally accepted first game of rugby on North American shores is in October. Harvard played McGill in 1874. So that's generally reckoned to be the first game of rugby. There was a Rutgers-Princeton game, I think, in 1869, which might have been rugby, but it's closer to football in terms of the rules that were played, because the rules were very, very fluid then. Rugby itself in American colleges flourished briefly in the years after the First World War, particularly when football had become a bit unruly, a bit too violent, and authorities were struggling to keep hold of it. So the British game, particularly on the West Coast, oddly, in places like Stanford, was quite strong for a while, but then football got its house in order and rugby retreated back into the shadows. It stayed in a few colleges. It really took off in a very minor way in American colleges in the 60s and 70s. And West Point was at the front of that. In 61, a cadet there picked it up. He noticed a piece in Life magazine about Pete Dawkins, who was a Heisman Trophy winner and first in his class at West Point, who was on a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford at the time, where there is no football. So he played rugby and played for the Oxford team against Cambridge in the big varsity game 2 years in a row. And Life magazine wrote a piece about him. So this West Point cadet, Peter Taylor, decided that the West Point should play rugby. It obviously looked like a fun game. And through his work and the work of his friends, it seeded and it stayed.
And something I'd love for you to talk about, because it came through in the book, is Pete Dawkins, when he was playing rugby, he brought a bit of American football flair. So because this is also a good way of explaining the mechanics and differences between rugby and football beyond just the obvious. What was he doing that so transfixed the Brits, given the way that he actually was bringing sort of quarterbacking to it?
No, it's quite funny. I found an Associated Press piece from the time where he described the differences. And the Brits were fascinated. He played on the wing, which is basically the closest analogy would be wide receiver, sort of strike player as such. He was huge and fast, an American athlete, and he played on the wing. So he was very, very big and very quick for a wing. No Brits had ever seen that kind of thing. But the main way he literally changed rugby in the rest of the world was, in those days, the wingers threw into the line out, which is the way you start the game after the ball's gone off the field. You throw the ball in and 2 players jump. Nowadays, people lift them, and you contest the ball that way. In those days, wingers threw in, and they always used to throw in underarm. That was just how it had always been done. So the ball went up to the 2 jumpers. Pete Dawkins came along and said, "Well, I'm going to do it football style," which in one varsity match of him doing it, and because in those days, varsity match was one of the very biggest sporting occasions in England. That changed the game. They said, why are we doing it underarm? And it works that way. It's now just, when I was a kid, I went to watch I saw a World Cup game in 91 that was played near my home. And it's the US Eagles, the men's team, played Italy. And they had a tap penalty move where they tapped a penalty, which is when you carry on playing. And their winger, Gary Hine, just threw it across the field, like football style. And to me, I was 13, to me and my little rugby friends, we were absolutely transfixed by that. It was so American, it was unbelievable. So that gave me a sort of vague idea of what Pete Dawkins did to the game. After him, after the early 60s, rugby at West Point was a club sport, not varsity, for a long, long time, nearly 50 years, which meant it was, as the book discusses, it was a sort of sport for people who were cut from the football team predominantly, or people who came over from wrestling or track or soccer or any other sport, and people who liked to party, which was part of the culture. It only went varsity it would have been 50 years. It went varsity in about 2015 after a minor scandal about conduct unbecoming cadets among the team at the time. They brought it into be varsity as a way of controlling it and as a way of putting it to the service of the West Point mission, which has obviously worked because they finally became national champions for the first time in 2022. So you go there now, there's a gleaming rugby centre down by the Hudson. There's very, very serious coaching. Almost all the players were recruited for rugby. It's definitely changed the culture since the early days and since the days I wrote about.
And something I'm curious about then is, you pointed out that you couldn't just cover every single one of the officers who came out of that 2002 class. Who did you choose? Who did you choose to profile, and what stuck out about their stories?
When I went up there, the book came about because in 2015 I went up for The Guardian just for a sort of exploratory visit to see if there were stories there. I didn't know anybody at all, so I contacted the athletics department. They sent me down, and I got lucky that Mike Mahan, the legendary coach who sadly died this year, age 75, he was just retiring from his second spell in charge, and he put out the seniors photo from the class of 2002 on his office desk, which is a sepia photo of them posing ridiculously and heroically in kilts. Very rugby photo. And he very simply pointed to three of the players who were no longer alive at that point, were no longer with us. Which is a point when you, I guess I don't know how you say it, but as a writer, as a journalist, you know when there's a story. You know there's going to be a story to tell. There's a point where you just get it. And obviously I got it then. And then you ask about those players. And the stories are stunning and fitting and needed to be told. So I told them in a shorter 5,000-word piece for The Guardian then, and years later it became a book. Those three cadets are Zach Miller, who was another Rhodes Scholar like Pete Dawkins, who died at Ranger School in summer of 2002 in accidental heat exhaustion death. Joe Emai, a centre on the field and the centre of the team in its sort of spirit and partying side, who drowned in an accident on a lake in Texas in September 2002. So pretty much before the next academic year had started, two of the 2002 team had died. And then Jim Gerbitz, the hooker, who was very much the sort of the spearhead of the team, again, literally spearhead on the field and off. He was killed in Baghdad in 2005. So that gave a natural center to the book, natural heart to the book. And then obviously you use the other players and family members and so on to tell those stories. And that's how the book is organized.
I'd love for you to give, and I think as folks saw, especially the women's rugby team from the U.S. do particularly well in this year's Olympics, I'd love for you just to talk about your love of rugby and why folks should be interested and compelled by it, especially if they're not in college themselves and having a lot of the options to play it in the first place.
I think you can see a lot. I don't think this is overstating it. In the try that won the women's sevens team the bronze medal, you can see a lot of what rugby is about. I mean, I'm not a sevens player, never was, never a sevens fan. Sevens hurts.
Could you distinguish the two styles then?
Yes. So regular rugby, as I would call it, 15 aside, played on a field about the same size as a football field, slightly wider. It's a very fast game these days, but there's more people, there's more contact, there's more slowing down, there's more tight phase and so on. 7-a-side rugby, sevens, which is in the Olympics, there are 7 people on each side on the same field. It was originally the Scots invented it as a kind of sadistic end-of-year form of fun. It was invented in the Scots borders as something to do at the end of the season to have fun. You have to be supremely fit, supremely dynamic to play sevens, and to play Olympic sevens, there are some extreme athletes there. And the try that won the women's team the bronze medal it has so much to attract people to rugby or explain rugby to it. They were down 7-5 to Australia in the bronze medal game. And the magnificently named Spiff Cedric, one of their players, a player from Life University in Georgia, which is one of the best colleges, got the ball, clock up, time up in her own 22, which is her own sort of goal area, and basically shrugged off a bigger Australian player was tackling her, and she had the strength to shrug her off, and then the speed to escape 2 more Australian players for a sort of 90-metre try right at the end to score under the post with a dive. And then obviously she ended up having to kick the extra 2 points to win the game, which she wasn't supposed to. So I thought that really just summed up in a very simple way what rugby can be. It's about strength and speed, and it's about never giving up, and strength and speed in contact, because there was a pretty shuddering contact to start that try. And it's fantastic in the way the game works around the world now, but has worked in America for perhaps for longer, that it was a women's game that showed that. The American men's team played very well. They had a very tough draw. They didn't make it past the quarterfinals. But the women's game in America is strong. It's getting stronger. It's getting very strong at the college level, and as a source of scholarships now as well. So it was a really fitting moment to show rugby to people. I mean, say it's sevens rugby, so when you see 15 against 15, it's a whole different game. But it's the theory and spirit of the game was there.
Speaking of games and victories, I should have asked the question if people were going to wonder, did your amateur team end up beating or losing to the West Point team?
We won. The score was either 41-25 or 45-21, as history cannot tell because the West Point report and my own report for my club have different scores on. I suspect West Point's is right because theirs is more detailed than mine. We did win, and as it was funny in finding the players and talking to them, it was fun. I mean, I've become, I've spent years working with some of these guys and become sort of friends to the point of being able to rib each other. And more than one of them admitted to me that they told themselves that we were professional players. why they'd lost to us. And I hated to tell them that we were a very good amateur club, but it was functionally the third team. It was the emerging players 15, from which some players emerged and went higher and some like me didn't. Yeah, it was those days. There was contact for American rugby with the outside world was rarer then. And that's another reason why it stuck in my head, because we didn't see many Americans around.
The thing that's helpful doing this from a UT Clement Center perspective is that folks here are looking at this through a higher education lens. Mm-hmm. How do sports work in the UK? Right. So there's not an equivalent of the NCAA. And when you're talking about rugby becoming a varsity sport, that means that this is now an NCAA sport in the US, separate from the sort of more amateur club dynamics. How does it work in the UK?
Totally different. I played at Durham University in the Northeast, which is constantly in the top 5 collegiate rugby sides in the UK. I played mostly second team for them, for some first teams, kind of a first team squad player if I flatter myself. So I played in and around the top level of college rugby in the UK, which has changed some, but not much. And our average crowd would have been about 5 people and a dog. I mean, we had a beautiful field in Durham, down by the river and underneath the cathedral. Magnificent playing surface, but there wasn't a stand. There was just a sort of lump of grass that you could stand on. You went, in those days, any higher than us. Oxford and Cambridge had stadiums, but they were made of wood and were very small. It's still pretty much like that. The top-level rugby in the UK has migrated to the clubs who run junior academy teams, the professional club size. Some colleges are involved with that. It's not even, there's no point of comparison between top college sports across in the US to the UK. It's hard to comprehend it when you come the way I came from the UK and you try and understand college sports. It's like, what? I mean, the varsity match between Oxford and Cambridge will get probably these days about 30,000 people to watch it at the National Stadium because it's the old traditional game. Used to get bigger crowds than that. It's the only one. The rugby varsity game, I mean, the boat race, a lot of people go down to the river to watch the rowing in London, but it's just not the same culture or anything. Almost all British professional sport has really revolutionized itself in the past 20 years to be winning a lot of Olympic gold medals these days, but it's not really done around universities. It's really done around professional sports. So yeah, I've been here 12 years and I'm now American and I still don't understand college sports.
And this is where there's the confusion over whether or not you were a professional team versus an amateur team all comes into play.
Yes.
Taking it back in this section to the West Point 02 class, as you pointed out, this is a class that had obviously signed up, gone to West Point before 9/11. Talk about that part of the class. I think it's just a fascinating set because those are people who are joining in the 1990s. The U.S. military, the Army, the world in general are going to look differently pre 9/11, obviously. Talk to that dynamic of their experiences.
Yeah, there's actually a because of 9/11, possibly less well-known book about a writer living with that class of 02, the bicentennial class, called Duty First. It's by a writer called Ed Ruggiero, who is a West Point grad and officer and teacher. And he wrote it, and it came out even in paperback before 9/11. So as is shown in the sort of first half of the Discovery documentary series that was made about the class, all the subjects who he talked to are talking about, well, we think we'll go to Kosovo to do some peacekeeping. That's kind of it. The Discovery Channel series that was made with the class has footage of a 2000 grad or a 2001 grad in Kosovo. That's what most of them figured they would do. I think it's Matt Blinn, the captain, told me, it's in the book, that he figured he'd get a marvelous free education, do 5 years, and then head out into the corporate world. perfectly serious about serving, just wasn't expecting to go to war because it was coming off the Clinton years and however long it was without a major war. That makes one of the most interesting chapters to write was the chapter about 9/11 itself and everybody's experience of it. Remarkable, just to try and place myself through witness testimony to what it was like to be in the West Point classrooms as it happened and as news came through. Matt again pointed out that he was in a banking class on the morning of 9/11 when the first plane went past, using the Hudson as its map. So it definitely went over the top of that classroom. But no, obviously nobody noticed. It's just a regular day. There are other stories of people meeting each other in the corridors, meeting other people, being told what had happened. Clinton Learnick, one of the players who actually, to be honest, as the book makes clear, is one of the least trustworthy narrators in there, told me that his last class before learning of 9/11 was counterterrorism, and said that the last thing that one of the instructors told the class was it's only a matter of time. The US soil will be hit. So they all, had their, I don't know about ambitions, how many would have gone infantry otherwise, because that's the most striking mark of it, but they had their outlook change. And I think 7 or 8 went infantry in the end. Were very gung-ho about it. And as has been well documented elsewhere, all the West Pointers who wanted infantry got it that year, because there became a hard-charging ambition to carry the fight. And that was why Zach Miller, the Rhodes Scholar, branched infantry, and that was why he was trying to fit it in Ranger School before going to Oxford in the summer, because he wanted to get it done, go to Oxford and come back. And it's, when you're writing a book, you come across narratives and through lines and you have to question them. There was some question of what should he have been trying to fit in Ranger School in the summer? Was that unusual? And you realise after doing some digging that it's not unusual for Rhodes graduates to do that, or Marshall scholars. There was a Marshall scholar from the rugby team the year before who did it, got through it, went to Edinburgh, came back and went off to war. The writer Craig Mullaney did it in class of 2000. He got a Rhodes Scholarship, so he did Ranger School before he went to Oxford and then came back and eventually ended up in Afghanistan. So they're all just pushing hard to get out. Once their outlook had changed, most of them were pushing hard to get into infantry.
The process you're describing, there's a variety of ways one could commission into the Army. There's OCS, there's traditional ROTC, and there's obviously West Point, direct commission for certain branches. But the West Point guys especially have opportunities like the Rhodes Scholarship, like Ranger School right afterwards. How does just surveying and speaking with the West Point rugby team and then surveilling the actual experiences of those who had passed away influence how you think about the various commissioning sources and the way that we structure the Army in terms of officer ascension?
Well, it's interesting, the constant question, I think I was aware of this culturally before I even got involved in writing about West Point, the sort of perception of West Pointers as ring knockers, favoured to go where they want to go, is an interesting one. None of them are very comfortable with it. I mean, none of them I don't think would be characterizable like that. They're rugby players. It's a bit different. I mean, I suppose that just means they're bros, but one of my wife's jokes is the book could functionally be called Bros Are People Too. It's a book about 15 bros. I'm a rugby bro, so it's like, bros have minds. As far as the sort of different structures goes, the most direct time that came up in my research and I thought about it was about that push for infantry. Was it 200 of the class went infantry? I think I haven't got the book in front of me. That's the figure that's in my head, which meant that places like RTC or OTC, one of those is British, the sort of regular college way through, people would find themselves bumped out, not getting what they wanted because West Point were being put on stream. I guess that's the point of West Point, right? It's the sort of Army's place where it makes most of its officers, if not most, a lot. And it's supposed to be a sort of streaming thing that way. It's different. Again, it's different with my experience of friends who left university when I did in Britain and went into the British Army, because Sandhurst is different. It's post-grad or pre-grad. It's a different kind of way of doing it. But again, I know there's some sort of frictions and resentments there, Sandhurst officer or not. So part of me thinks, I mean, it could also be some of their career decisions were influenced by playing rugby. I mean, the story of Jim Gerbitz, who died, he didn't make the infantry. He branched infantry, but couldn't do it because of a rugby injury. ended up stuck in transportation, miserable, and by all accounts, including his wife's drinking, stuck at Fort Benning. And then a West Point graduate rugby player from the class of 60-something, who was a colonel in transportation, found him and picked him up and gave him a job running security platoons purely because he was a West Point rugby player, which I guess that's the kind of informal networking-based promotion that happens in any business, it's who you know or who you meet. And of course, as the book says, without giving too much away, that was a move for Jim that had profound and deadly consequences ultimately for him. So it's, I think, the streams of West Point life play on them like they would on anybody, really, as far as I can see.
I think the big last question here would be, obviously we focused on 3 that you profiled who passed away or were killed in action, but can you speak to where the rest of folks ended up, especially given your point that for a lot of people, they were joining a 1990s military, the 5-year commitment versus a longer-term career had different implications. Speak to that part.
Yeah, there's a fascinating... I mean, all of them, all 15 of them, or all 15 plus the coach, could have presented biographies of their own for what they saw. A couple of guys went air defense artillery, so as the book points out, they didn't really have much to do in the Iraq or Afghanistan wars. One of them, Dave, the number 8, Dave Little, ended up loading ships, was pretty much what he did in the theatre, and then went home, so it might be quite a boring biography. But there are various guys, and I suppose if you end up homing on the military again, the 2 case studies I think of how the 9/11 wars affected people, which are in the book, but not the focus of the book. Pete Chacon, one of the wingers, went infantry and he survived an IED in Mosul in 2004. And he gives a remarkable account of surviving it in the book. It's remarkable in part because it's very funny. It's got that black, dark army humour there about the way his men reacted after how he told them to and so on. But also he told me about the injuries he picked up, and he said he'd recently tweezed probably the last bit of Iraqi road out of his face about 10, 15 years later from like fractions of concrete. Without going into detail, Pete's home life has been not smooth. I don't think anybody's home life has been completely smooth. But I think Pete saw some things. I'm probably talking too much for him there. The other one is Mo Green, the fly half, who went Special Forces quite quickly. And when I first wrote about them for The Guardian, I didn't reach him because he was still in the Middle East somewhere doing whatever he was doing. When I did get him for the book, because he was out, he said, look, I'm not going to talk about what I did operationally, but read Stanley McChrystal's memoir and it's pretty much there. So I did. And, I mean, in all such things, particularly, I suppose, in a sports team environment or a rugby environment, when you're not recording, when you're not on record, and everyone's had a few stories come out about what people saw and did. And Mo saw some very serious action in the Middle East, into Syria and so on, in a very long career. He's come out and is now out. His wife's a country singer. She's successful. He's working in recruitment and tech. He seems to be doing pretty well. There wouldn't be an individual case of someone who's had a desperately difficult reintroduction to society. So the book more focuses on some of what it's been like for the families who are left behind.
So to wrap on a positive note, I'd be curious, given what we were just saying about the women's sevens team performance at the Olympics, and just the fact that this book is clearly a love letter to rugby and your time in the sport, what are rugby's prospects in the United States?
They're interesting. There is a men's 15-a-side professional league called Major League Rugby, which is now in its 7th year. It lost one season to COVID, but it's just completed its latest season. It's up and down. Crowd sizes are small, wages are small, but it's still here, which is quite something for American rugby. It's been going that long. There is a women's pro or semi-pro league about to start, which is going to have a lot of challenges, but Women's Elite Rugby is giving it a go. It's just announced its first few cities. The sevens is a bit different because sevens tournaments tend to be sort of 1 or 2 day things, which is hard to really monetize. There's Premier Rugby Sevens, a company that It's trying to monetize it. Hasn't played this year, partly because of the Olympics being on. But if it staged
There's
sevens,
only so much.
yeah,
There's only so much attention that could go around.
I'm hoping that sevens comes back. They're good guys. And then most importantly for American rugby, the World Rugby is taking a bet and has put the Men's World Cup in 2031 and the Women's World Cup in 2033 in the US. So they're building towards that. There's a lot of work to be done. I went to some events in DC last month with interested cities, and then the Scotland against the USA men's game at Audi Field, which attracted, I think, 17,000 fans, which was good. To see the men's team lose to Scotland, because the men's team they've always had some catching up to do. It's never a level playing field for the American sides. They never have time together. They have to scratch players from around the world, but they look better. They're improving. So that the next 7 years from here, it's about 7 years from now, it'll be kicking off. That's the sort of big push for World Rugby to establish itself here. College game is increasing, high school game is increasing. My 3 girls, who are aged 7 to 11, have just finished their first season of touch rugby in the DC suburbs, which is incredibly well organized and lots of kids playing. So it's looking as good as it ever has done. It's just the next 7 years will tell.
That's a great way of outlining the next few years without any specific prediction as to how that will actually play out. So, Martin, thank you so much for joining me on Horns of the Dilemma. It was great to have you out at UT, but it's also great to follow up with you now that we have the Olympic hook.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.